So one of the things that I thought as I was starting to put the questions together for this is I hear a lot about biosecurity, as everyone does in agriculture. But what I didn't know so much about was what are the structures and policies and procedures that we have in place to manage that. And so, Joe, I thought it would be, and I figure if I don't know that, then I'm sure there's a whole bunch of people in the room who don't know that. I was wondering if you might start with us just a little bit of background around, what it is that your role does. Who are the people that report to you? What are the things that you're looking after and controlling in relation to managing biosecurity for New South Wales?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. And thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm really honoured to have been invited, and really I just want to highlight the wonderful work that my team do. So yeah, it's obviously you are nothing without your team. So that's a great question to start off with, actually. So essentially, under the law, I am the Secretary's delegate. And so the CVO can, as the Secretary's delegate, enact the Biosecurity Act and other regulations that fall under the Biosecurity Act. So how do you put that in layman's terms? Well, essentially we are trying to mitigate, eliminate or respond to biosecurity risks, and those that particularly relate to animals and aquatics, so any of the diseases that are considered a risk to animal or aquatic health. Obviously, that doesn't mean we do everything in our powers to eliminate every single disease that's out there, because endemic disease, i.e. disease that's just circling around and we know is already here, is going to be very hard to eliminate. But there are certain diseases, and the big one that everyone often thinks about in Australia because of recent times is foot and mouth disease, that are exotic to Australia, that would have a major impact to our economy, to animal health, not necessarily to the environment, but there are certain diseases that would, and so any of these diseases that could have a major impact to certain aspects, be it health, economy, environment, we decide that we would respond to at a much higher level. And often these decisions actually come from the global picture. So the World Organization for Animal Health have lists of diseases that are considered extremely important, and then that filters down to the country level and obviously then down to the state level. So in short, and I've come around this quite a long way, but I think it's really important to paint the picture of why we do what we do. A lot of these diseases are to maintain, for example, our great trade status, because we can trade at a much higher level with certain trade partners because we are free of diseases that other countries are not free of. And so basically my role is to try to ensure that firstly we don't get those diseases, but obviously that's not all in my control because we're only one state here, and we have the border, and we have New South Wales, by the way, has almost 50% of returning passengers coming through Australia arrive in New South Wales. So some of it's out of our control. So then the next step is, well, then how do we prepare to respond in the event that we do get a disease incursion that we are obliged to respond to? And then the other part of your question was, what does my team structure look like? So I head up animal biosecurity, but I sit within biosecurity and food safety. And that's within the Department of Primary Industries. So I guess the overarching goal of the Department of Primary Industries is to enable, protect, and I guess promote the primary industries in New South Wales. And then within that we have the Biosecurity and Food Safety Division, which speaks for itself. So it's all plant, animal biosecurity, food safety, but also emergency response, which I'll talk about in a second. And then animal biosecurity, essentially how we're structured is I have multiple leaders within my team. I have 3 deputy CVOs, and one of those is my manager for preparedness and response, Liz Braddon. One is Emily Doyle, who is my manager for surveillance and engagement. I then have Reese Powell currently, who sits within the CVO unit and essentially helps me with all the policy making decisions and those sort of higher level technical aspects. Then I have an aquatic manager and a traceability manager. And so, yeah, across the team, we're sort of covering that whole spectrum. And then obviously we have senior vets or senior policy officers, and then veterinary officers or policy officers that sit down below those leaders. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And yeah, the why, I guess, is the important thing to lead off with of what we do.
You know, that's great, Joe. That puts a lot of context around it. And so much clearer now on the structure. You know, what are the things that are happening on a day-to-day basis that your team is managing in relation to, you know, staying in front of, you know, biosecurity potential issues, threats, and those sort of things? How does that play out in a practical sense?
So many things, Ben. I was just saying to someone else on my table, obviously I'm fairly new to the role, and I anticipated the animal biosecurity bit of it, but I don't know that I realised how large the aquatic space is, for starters, and how complicated. Obviously my expertise was all in the terrestrial side of things, so luckily I have a fantastic aquatic team, technically and otherwise. But yeah, day to day, it literally could be anything from ships wishing to clean their hulls in Sydney Harbour to engagement with industry. So I know Verity here from the Australian chicken meat industry very well. To animal health committee meetings. So the animal health committee is all the chief veterinary officers, the Australian chief veterinary officer, the lab in Geelong. And this afternoon actually is a workshop for high pathogenic avian influenza preparedness that I've got to dash off to, because we're discussing that at that AHC level. To obviously all the projects that we have ongoing all the time around surveillance for disease, the engagement piece I'd love to talk about a little bit, and then obviously any kind of responses we're engaged in, and honestly we're probably engaged in one kind of a response or another, be it on a small level or higher, pretty much all the time. Even if it's just a minor investigation that needs to be cleared up, they'll all come across my desk essentially. So yeah, it's super varied, really interesting. No day is ever the same.
That's great. But you mentioned the engagement piece. So when you talk about that, is that engagement with industry? Like, when you look at engagement from your department, what does that actually mean? Yeah,
so both industry and the veterinary profession, I'd say. But yeah, industry is critical because in the event of an outbreak, they're on the front line. It's firstly from the notification side of things. So, the farmers are the front line of detection, aren't they? So, it's going to be them that see something wrong with their animals, calls it in. You've probably seen the infographics, seen anything unusual, call the hotline. And so it's really critical that we keep engaging them in that process, because we often say biosecurity is a shared responsibility, and it absolutely is, and we'd be nothing without the producers. And so obviously I can't go around and talk to every single producer in New South Wales, but we engage with the industry peak bodies, and through them and New South Wales farmers, we try to continue that story going round and around, because as I was just saying, you have events like Indonesia getting FMD, foot and mouth disease, and lumpy skin disease, and there's a big flurry of activity and everybody wants to try and do more preparedness or high path avian influenza. But then if that risk starts to die away, if Indonesia do eradicate, which they have called it endemic for now, but they are aiming to eradicate, we'll have a new generation come through that may not have had that engagement. So I think it's continued engagement is critical, but also within the veterinary space. So we've done a lot of work with trying to engage private vets, because we're very lucky in New South Wales to have an incredible district vet network. But again, it's the private vets in the time of an outbreak, or it's the private vets that are doing that sort of day-to-day assessment of stock that could be our early warning system. So yeah, it's all of those, but also universities. So talking to the new vets coming through it's super hard to get vets into rural areas, as I'm sure you all know, and you know, so I take any opportunity I can to go and talk to the students, and I kind of enjoyed my life in academia and teaching students, so I always love to go and actually talk to them about other career opportunities that are outside the cities, and yeah, so all of those kinds of things.
I want to come back to the avian influenza. One of the things that I'd be interested in how you address the challenge is, you know, the news cycle, you know, the media, you know, everything moves on very quickly, and so lumpy skin and foot and mouth was very, very topical for a long time, but it moves on. So how does your department go around, you know, keeping it front and centre for people and making sure that it doesn't sort of slip the priority list?
I think, as I say, it's that continued cycle of engagement. The preparedness piece means that we always have, and I think you may talk, well, I'd love to talk about how we do respond to disease outbreaks, but our preparedness means that we are always sort of ready to go and ready to do that engagement. But in terms of keeping people aware, I mean, I think the media do a really good job, and the biosecurity is now at the forefront of people's minds. I think it's just key that we sort of keep reinforcing that. So we do, I mean, we've got comms plans, we have got you know, a really good comms department. I've got people within my own team who are excellent in comms, and they're in some national groups. There's a National Biosecurity Communication and Engagement Network, NEBSN, and one of my team members actually sits in NEBSN. So all the national talking points that are constantly developed, you know, we're engaged with as well, and that means we can then feed them on to our stakeholders.
Yeah, I'm glad you opened the door on the response piece, because, you know, let's just assume that we're in the war room for a minute, and, you know, we've got the avian influenza, and, you know, there's some stuff that's been quite concerning reported in the US around transmission to dairy cows, and I think there's now been a case identified in humans. Yeah, we've had an outbreak here in New South Wales. What happens next?
We haven't had high path AI in New South Wales.
No,
only
just as
if we do.
Yeah,
okay, yeah. Sorry. So,
just in case you hadn't known, we've had an outbreak this morning. No, just
yeah. So, yeah. So I guess, I mean, from our perspective, the news has been made because of the dairy cows in the US and the farm cat, but probably more concerning for us are the detections in Antarctica, in the aquatic mammals, the sea mammals, and also the birds down there, because of course they are on the migratory pathway that could come to Australia. And all the modelling is indicating that it's likely to be those migratory birds that bring it in, especially this clade, so that we have different terms for viruses, and I'm no virologist either, so bear with me, but the clade that is currently concerning everyone is very persistent in wild birds, in migratory birds, and so that's the big concern. And so there's been modelling, and so it could come up from Antarctica. Equally, it could come down from Southeast Asia. So there's been all of that modelling. There's constantly discussions about what we might do, but taking the step back to how we respond to any emergency animal disease outbreak, we are, and I don't know if we're unique in Australia with this, but there certainly aren't many countries in the world that have this. We have what's called the EADRA, which is the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement. It's just had its 20th anniversary, I think, recently, so it's been established for quite a long time. And the EADRA was formed so that industry and government would cost share emergency animal disease responses. So it's only our terrestrial animal diseases. Unfortunately, there isn't a similar agreement in the aquatic space, which is problematic at times. But what that means is not only are we cost sharing it, we're also coming together very regularly to discuss how we might respond. And we have all these manuals that sit with Animal Health Australia, and they are all response manuals to specific emergency animal diseases, the AusVet Plan manuals. And so those manuals, while they're not policy and they don't dictate specifically how we would respond, they are the guidance documents for how we would respond. So that's sort of the overview from that holistic perspective. And I just think that's fantastic because firstly, it means industry and government have come together on the same page, developed these manuals, and they've committed to cost sharing the response. What then happens though on the more nitty-gritty side of things is we have an emergency response structure within New South Wales, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and it's the AIMS structure, which is the Australasian Interagency Incident Management Structure. And it's under that structure that we do all our responses. Now, I had no idea this really, well, I sort of knew it existed, but I didn't understand about the structure until I came into this role. And again, it's actually given me real confidence because I just used to, from the industry side of things, go, oh, wow, what would happen if HPAI arrived or FMD arrived? Well, there's a response structure in place which is used for fires, floods, all emergency responses, and that would be invoked in the case of something like HPAI as well. And so what that means is the poor Chief Veterinary Officer doesn't have to be up 24 hours a day running the whole response themselves. They are there to guide the technical aspects of the response, run the epidemiology aspects of the response, talk to industry, of course, but the actual response and how that's done is run by this structure. So you'd have an incident controller, you'd have the forward posts, etc., the kind of thing I'm sure you've all heard around with fires. And so what the CVO has to do then is actually set the intent, so the CVO intent of the response. And again, under EADRA, we would come together, and it's called the Consultative Committee for Emergency Animal Diseases. There's so many acronyms, it's not even funny, but this committee comes together, and on day one, they sit down and they say, right, what's our intent for this response? And that is, do we try to eradicate? Do we try to just contain? Or do we say, there's no way we're going to be able to do anything here, this is not eradicable, it's going to be endemic? And we make that decision together. We then put that up to the National Management Group, and they're the purse holders, so they're the sort of Director Generals, as it was in the DPI, of all the different states and territories, and they decide whether, yes, they will invest in the proposed response. And I don't know that they've ever knocked back a CCEAD proposal before you ask the questions. So, they trust that, I think, that technical committee to actually come up with the plan. And then from there, from the CVO intent, the response plan is designed and, again, signed off on. Now, I'm not saying we have them in our back pocket, but we certainly have the outlines of how we would respond, firstly because of AusVet Plan, and so that sort of gives a bit of a blueprint, but then also around the Biosecurity Act and the intentions around the Act, which is to contain, eradicate, and minimise the spread of diseases. And so you can imagine what that looks like is, you put quarantine in around and so if it was a specific farm, you put a control order in around that farm, or you put in an individual biosecurity direction to start with, probably, and then you would try to, and everyone, is anyone still eating? No, so I won't get into the gruesome aspects of it, but unfortunately, biosecurity responses are not particularly pleasant, and if you do decide to eradicate, that's probably going to mean destruction of animals, and then the disposal and the decontamination. So Triple D, we often call it, is a massive part of what my team do in terms of the preparedness, because in a wide-scale outbreak, we need to know how we're going to be able to handle that. So that's sort of it, the start of it, and let's hope that's all we'd have to do and then it's done. But we know that some responses could go on for some time and be very intricate and detailed. But that's sort of the overview of how it would start anyway.
Yeah, no, and I think when you think about how this responds out, it's you sort of see how this plays out through sort of mainstream agriculture. You have farming and farmers and farmer groups who know exactly how many animals they've got on, where they're housed, the interactions that the animals have had. How does this response play out from a I guess a feral animal population, and also, my lovely mum lives in town. She's got 10 chooks. How does it play out across those sorts of domestic animal owners as well?
Yeah, so the feral animal piece is really interesting because, and quite controversial at times, I think, because obviously farmers are understandably very concerned about the risks that feral animals might pose. But the crux of biosecurity on an enterprise for me is you ask the questions: can I minimise the risk of disease getting onto my farm? Can I minimise the risk of disease spreading within my farm? And can I minimise the risk of disease leaving my farm? And in the case of poultry, when you say feral animals, we are talking things like wild birds, and I highly doubt anyone's going to sign off on us, controlling wild birds. It's not going to be feasible, and the poultry industry are very aware of this. And so it's about doubling down on how you actually protect your poultry from the external sources of disease. And enterprises that are free range are going to have more difficulty doing that, obviously. But these are all the kinds of things we're discussing with industry, and industry are discussing themselves, is how can they protect themselves better. And then in the case of foot and mouth disease, there was modelling done on the feral pig issue. And interestingly, pigs, so foot and mouth disease expresses itself very differently in different animals. And so the modelling that was done actually showed that because pigs get really quite sore, and some animals like sheep don't hardly show any signs, they don't really get any more lame than they might with low-grade foot rot. But pigs get really, really sore and will tend to actually not stray very far. And so is the risk of them actually wandering onto properties as high as we think it is if they've got the disease? It may not be. And I don't know how long ago that modelling was done and how, what it's thought of now in terms of that level of risk. But again, it's, well, how do you protect yourself? And if you hear that foot and mouth disease is in the country, have you got measures you could put in place to actually protect your animals from feral animals coming onto the property? So that's what I'd say. And, when I was working in dairy, we had issues and we did a lot of looking into this around milk tankers which go from farm to farm to farm to farm and do not clean on and off farm. The poultry industries did a lot of work because of salmonella on getting truck washes in place and having facilities to clean trucks on and off farms. Dairy have never needed to do that because they've never had an outbreak of something that could be carried by a truck. And so there was a lot of discussion around, well, what might that look like? And, I worked down near the Otways where half the farms, you could only just about get the tanker down the driveway, let alone put a cleaning facility in there on every farm. And you've got 4,000 dairy farms in Australia. So again, it's then, well, how would the industry be able to think around, in the event of an outbreak, quickly putting in place those kinds of provisions? So I think that's what I'd say around the preparedness piece. And then in terms of the small farm, backyard type person, well, of course, another area here that we haven't touched on yet is traceability. But traceability in any kind of disease outbreak is absolutely critical. And we don't always have a good idea of how many of those, unless you've got a certain number of animals, you're not obliged to actually be recorded in the system. If you've only got half a dozen chooks, you wouldn't. So again, then it's general public awareness of, what people may need to look out for, that they are obliged to still report any signs of disease, whether they're a commercial operation or just a hobby farmer. And then, of course, some messaging around how they could improve their biosecurity as well. But people who have got very, very, well-loved pet chooks, they're probably going to have them in the house with them because, I think when Newcastle, from what I've heard, when Newcastle disease happened in in New South Wales, people were trying to smuggle their budgies out of the area because they were worried that their budgies were going to be taken by the authorities. So I don't think we'll have problems with people adhering to rules. It's more around, you know, making sure they understand that they should also be reporting anything unusual.
Yeah, no, I can definitely relate to that, Joe. I think when I left for boarding school, my room got turned into a chook house. Maybe one more question from me, and then over to the floor. When you think about, you know, the different, and we've touched on foot and mouth and avian influenza, you know, what are the other sort of biosecurity risks that your team is actively managing outside of those, or monitoring maybe is a better word, and which one of those sort of, you know, keeps you up at night in terms of, you know, if it were to be found here that would, you know, cause us, you know, the most amount of grief?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what are we doing day to day? I haven't really gone in detail into the aquatic side of things, but several of my aquatic team members are doing a big engagement project with recreational fishers to highlight the need for cleaning their equipment in between going from water body to water body. So it's those kinds of, again, awareness campaigns, so they, you know, clean their boat, clean their equipment, so they're not potentially spreading marine pests from waterway to waterway. White spot, which is a disease of prawns, and was a big response that was carried out just before I came into the role, is another one that is still keeping my team pretty busy. I've got a whole manager dedicated to the white spot program. And so for the last year, we're halfway through now our surveillance for what we call proof of freedom. So the Clarence zone, which was what was set up when white spot happened, is still in place. And we can't lift that zone, the control order on that zone, until we've achieved proof of freedom. And that's 2 years worth of surveillance. So we've just conducted our second round of surveillance. It's four lots of testing of wild prawns. And we've just conducted our second round, and I'm very happy to say it was all negative. So we're halfway through that 2-year period. And if at the end of the 2 years we have all negatives from our surveillance, then we can apply for freedom from the World Organization for Animal Health from the disease. So that's another one that we're very busy with. But in terms of surveillance in the terrestrial animal space, you know, we've got. I mean, I looked at there's a production called Animal Health Surveillance Quarterly that comes out from Animal Health Australia, and it's available to the public. And the last quarterly edition is about to be published, and I'd say have a look on Animal Health Australia's website probably in a week or two, I think it'll be published. I was looking at the numbers of disease submissions that go through the labs of all the different jurisdictions, and the New South Wales numbers are just astronomical. So every day, our private vets, our government vets are putting submissions of laboratory samples through our lab, which is in Camden, EMAI, and you know that's to exclude diseases that could be exotic. But it's also for those diseases that are endemic to Australia that we still need to keep track of, because either we're obliged to because of our reporting requirements, or because we just want to know if certain diseases are starting to, you know, creep up in terms of the numbers of cases. So I guess that's another big body of work that I've got several team members that are working on that constantly, just churning out those numbers and calculating what kind of numbers we're seeing in terms of different animal diseases and how many exclusions we're doing. So that's that. And then I guess the other part of your question, which is what keeps me awake at night, it's having come in the role. I mean, when I came in the role, it was certainly foot and mouth disease, a big foot and mouth disease outbreak. Now I'm in the role, I realise that the way everything's organised and the measures that are already in place and the plans that have already been made means that isn't the thing that probably keeps me awake at night. It's the disease we don't know about yet, you know, and especially the zoonotic disease that, you know, may freely pass. And we were talking about HPAI before. this clade of HPAI, while it's devastating to poultry and is spread by wild birds, there's only been one human death. And obviously that's very sad, but we're not talking about something that can just spread like wildfire through humans as well. So I think it's that potential zoonosis that can easily spread between animals and humans that we don't even know about yet. That's the one that, because the complexity of the response to something that's across animals, humans, and potentially is spread in the environment is another whole level. And so, and obviously we had Japanese encephalitis virus recently, which could be spread between animals and humans, but again, it was only people in very close contact with those animals, so it wasn't just widely spread. So yeah, I think that's the one, and who knows what it might be or when it might be. And Verity and I have worked for many years on antimicrobial resistance together, and it may not be that virus, it might be a multi-drug resistant bacteria that could actually be the thing that really hits us for six that we didn't see coming.
Thank you, Jo. Some incredible insight there. I cannot believe how busy you must be with the number of things that you need to manage on a day-to-day basis. And so Jo has very kindly offered to take questions from the floor. So please, if you can let people know who you are and where you're from, and a question for Jo.
Jo, you mentioned traceability, and we're obviously refreshing the NLIS at the moment. Where are our other gaps on traceability with animals, and what are we doing to address those gaps?
Yeah, great question.
I do want to say also, what's your favourite zoonosis movie to leave with us as well?
Oh, the only one that immediately springs to mind was Contagion. That was, But great question. And we got quite a big injection of funding, FMD preparedness funding, before I came into the role. And some of the funding from that went towards some social research into traceability, actually. So, and it was actually engaging with stakeholders and asking them what they understood of traceability, its importance, and then also trying to look at where the gaps were. And the big one that came out, so people see the importance of it, but a lot of people, I think they're a little confused because they're thinking about that farm to fork, and they're thinking traceability through the supply chain, not traceability for disease control. So I think there's probably some comms to be done there, because look, the quicker we can shut down a disease, the quicker we can deal with it and be moving on and actually, saving money for everyone essentially, and animals of course. But one of the big gaps we identified is the property to property transfers. So people are recording in the system when they're selling their animals, they're recording in the system so those ENVDs, so the vendor declarations, but it's the transfers from one owner to another owner. And off the top of my head, the numbers they were certainly both over 50% for both cattle and sheep of P2P transfers were not being done. And there was a bit of a lack of understanding, I think. It wasn't, let's say it wasn't negligence per se, but a bit of a lack of understanding of the responsibility to do that. So I think that's a big gap, because in the event of an outbreak, we might get those movements to abattoirs or to sale yards or whatever, but to other properties, and they're the ones that could be another whole, another whole clade of an outbreak. We might think it's only down here, and then all of a sudden it's up there without our knowledge. So So what are we doing about it? Firstly, we are hoping to get enough funding again to continue some of that social science research, but it'll be that sort of voluntary compliance, because obviously we'd rather voluntary compliance than enforced compliance actions. And so awareness campaigns to producers that, that's what they need to do and why, I guess. But also we're looking at sort of improving understanding at showgrounds and things like that of the importance of those movement, documentation.
Thanks, George. Joe, just taking me back to the avian influenza crossing over into dairy cows for a second. So if that did come to Australia, what impact would that have on the herd here? Is it just dairy? Would it go to beef cattle as well? And how easily does it spread?
Yeah, so I don't know all the technical details because it's quite new, obviously. It's only just arrived in the US. But from what I've read so far, they've quite quickly tried to do some research on the, what should we call it, the transmissibility of it from cow to cow. And from cow to human, importantly. And from my understanding, they're not finding it to be that transmissible. So could it come to Australia? Well, not via cows because we don't allow any cows in from the US. Could it be spread via other means? It's looking like the risk is pretty low because for that cow to transmit it to a human and then for the human to have enough dose that they're infected and can transmit it again is pretty low likelihood from my understanding so far of what I've read in the literature from the US. But obviously, and again, what's the impact on the herd were it to get here? Well, from what I've heard, it's actually only a small drop in production. So to be honest, when I was a dairy vet, you'd probably see a far larger drop in production from lameness in your dairy cows. And I don't know that all the dairy farmers out there are quite on top of that yet in Australia.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I want to introduce myself because probably nobody knows me around here. My name is Jose Quinteros. I'm the lecturer in poultry health at the University of Sydney, appointed last year. And it's very interesting, Joe. Thanks so much for your information. The information you provided. It's interesting what you said about engaging more students into ag. I think it's a serious problem nowadays, not just in Australia but in the world, that our students are not much interested in going and work in the countryside, and we're gonna have to pay for that. And yeah, that's serious. So it's our role to engage and show how fun this part of the business is. My question is about something you said, and it's not related with influenza, about what you said about that there is some analysis there about in the country about when you have a new disease, if you can actually eradicate the disease or not, and how much effort you put on that. I'm aware that in 2019 we had salmonella enteritis entering the country. It's an exotic disease in Australia, and I remember at that time, and I don't know if that changed, but the efforts of the government was to actually eradicate salmonella enteritis completely from the country, and not going back to. So no introducing a new live vaccine or attenuated vaccine or for salmonella enteritis. What's the position now that it's been several years? It's still the idea is to fully eradicate salmonella enteritis in the country, or is it a different perspective now and recognize it as endemic, or what is the next steps? Do you know something about that?
I think I'd have to take that up with the Animal Health Committee, where they discuss, as I understand it, it's still on the National Notifiable Disease List. We are managing cases as they come up with industry. So, but I think generally the idea is to eradicate within an enterprise. But yeah, the actual specifics of the national picture I'd have to take up with the Animal Health Committee. But thanks, Jose, and good to see you here. And I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, a figure that was thrown at me before this speech was, or before this conversation, was that the primary industries in New South Wales last year, and I know there's some bankers here, so you probably know this, was circa 21 billion GVP. So, if you put that in front of students who are thinking, I want to get into an industry that's vibrant and, it has good economics behind it. I mean, that sounds fantastic to me. But it's just, I think it's also opening their eyes to being, I've just moved to Orange and I had no idea what a vibrant, amazing country town Orange is. and has an amazing sort of economy around it that is built by agriculture. So yeah, I think it's so important that we get those messages to school kids and then students coming through the university system for sure.
I hear Orange is almost as vibrant as Merrywall. There's a lot of interest in the room. 2 more questions.
It's not as vibrant as Dubbo, though, I've got to say. Darryl Anderson's my name. I'm from Anvil Media. It's kind of a 3-part question, but it's really only one question. You mentioned looking at avian influenza, and given that we're the only continent that's now not got it, or the current version of it, is it inevitable that we do get it, given migratory birds that you mentioned? How surprised? Second part: how surprised will you be if in perhaps the next 24 months, given that's 2 cycles of bird migration, that we don't have a detection? And finally, you mentioned the Triple D response. If it is, depending on your answer to those 2 parts, is the Triple D response actually worth the disruption if it's actually going to end up being endemic, which you might not regard as inevitable anyway? So, over to you.
3-part question, love those. I'm glad I only had half a sip of wine before I came up. So, is it inevitable? Many people are saying it is. Do I think it is? I couldn't say, because I'm not one of those modelers. I've looked at all the migratory bird pathways on the maps and things, and we've had many people talk to us about the risks. So yeah, I actually can't answer, is it inevitable? But I can tell you that a lot of people think it is. So that's the general sort of feeling out there. Would I be surprised if in 2 cycles? Well, again, I can't really answer that, because if I don't know if it's inevitable or can't say, I couldn't say would I. But look, I think people thought LSD in the next monsoon was going to come down, and it didn't. So who knows? It all depends on weather, climate, the bird movements themselves. And then, is Triple D going to be feasible? I think that, I think that would depend on how it got here, how many migratory birds it got here in, and then how quickly it was spreading. So I wasn't going to go down the Varroa route, because that's not under my area. It's the Chief Plant Protection Officer. But you saw how Varroa got away from the response, and then eventually it couldn't be eradicated anymore, and it could end up looking like that in the first instance. And look, I don't know that it's going to land in New South Wales, because the way the migratory birds come, it's not looking like that. So it might not be my decision, or no, I may not be the one putting that paper up to CCEAD in the first instance, but that would be a group decision that would be made. And I think the thing with the ADRA is, and emergency animal diseases, and the reason they're on those lists is because the intent is generally to eradicate, right? So at the moment the intent would be to eradicate, but in the event that it got here, it would be based on the risk assessment, the epidemiology assessment at the time that it got here.
Thanks. Verity Price, Deputy CEO at the Australian Chicken Meat Federation. I'll make it an easy one for you after that, Joe, because that was brutal. But just on that, I think it is really important to note that you could have an endemic disease in the environment. That doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be an endemic disease within commercial poultry units. So I think that is a really important delineation to make. My question is about surveillance, and you touched on it at the end, Joe. Do you think there is a need for greater collaboration with our international counterparts on their surveillance, so that our surveillance can be more meaningful? And obviously looking at HPAI, understanding where those more virulent strains are located and how it is they're moving in Southeast Asia would undoubtedly help us in our risk assessment and surveillance here in Australia. So maybe a bit harder in Antarctica.
I was going to say, I think that, that obviously that would be ideal, but I would assume that would have to be a Commonwealth conversation with the other countries. And I think there are some international networks on, like lab networks on surveillance for certain diseases. So I guess it's just whether or not that fell within those kinds of organisations. But yeah, we've got agreements with Wildlife Health Australia. There's a whole lab network in Australia. So at least we have very good collaboration on our surveillance data. But yeah, absolutely. Any early warning systems are going to be very helpful.